So, you guys know Paul. He is a frequent guest to the channel. Awesome historian leading in sort of the hoplite world. And Paul and myself did a little post a couple months ago asking you guys to give us some questions that you had about hoplites, hoplite warfare in general. And we are going to answer those today. So I've printed them all out. And I guess we'll probably just alternate who answers what, or both chip in at certain times to basically answer your guys' pressing questions about ancient Greek warfare. Okay, so Paul, our first question is essentially, why did the Corinthian helmet fall out of use? Because it's their favourite helmet. Why did it fall out of use in favour for more open helmets, such as the Attic or the Illyrian and the Pylos, those types of things?
So this is actually a fairly easy question to answer, and I have some props. Hold on. So I have a Corinthian helmet here, and this helmet is great if your primary worry in the world is getting hit in the face with a spear or an arrow or a rock or a sling, right? Very small holes in which to actually hit your enemy. It protects all the way down to the throat. I won't put it on, but you can see it protects all the way down to my throat. It's a great helmet. The problem with it is it has no cutouts for the ears. So when you're inside of this thing, it's like being in a bell. And you can hear, but you can't tell where the sound is coming from, which is weird. So like if you have a signal like a trumpet that says advance, you'll hear that and you'll know what to do. If someone were to yell at you from one side or the other, it's very difficult to figure out where they are. The other thing is when you're yelling through this, it's hard to understand what you're saying. So even me trying to yell at the people around me is difficult. And I know because we do shows a lot, for kids, and just trying to talk to them through this is really difficult. The way around this was that hoplites started to just wear it on the top of their head like this. So whenever they were not actually in combat, they would wear it like this. My guess is they wear it like this a lot of times, even when they were within missile range, but sort of at the extreme, just sort of hanging out because it's just easier way to wear it. And the crazy thing about it is you see this on vases all the time. And eventually this becomes a helmet in Italy. They essentially look at the vases and they look at the fact that they're wearing this on their head the whole time. And they start to create a helmet called the Pulo-Corinthian helmet or a Talo-Corinthian helmet, which is essentially this on their heads. So it's a fascinating little insight into the helmet itself and sort of how it, pushed the evolution. If I can reach behind me again, this helmet is probably my current favorite. This is the answer in terms of what comes next, right? So this has ear holes so you can hear. It has big cheek pieces. Again, it protects the face, really well. Doesn't protect the throat as well, but it's much more open. Now I can breathe through this. So if I'm doing a lot more activity, I can breathe better. And my vision's actually pretty good in the Corinthian, but the vision's better in this. And if my prime motive is not to be worried about getting hit with arrows and rocks and thrown spears, this is actually good enough to protect you from spear fighting man to man in a line in a shield wall. And this shouldn't be surprising because throughout most of history, shields, I mean helmets that are meant for close in fighting don't have more protection than this. I mean, obviously, medieval knights, but beyond them, helmets like this were sort of the norm for fighting man to man.
Yeah, I think another thing that's interesting is the coverage of that. That one, I believe, is 450 BC, that one it's based on from the British Museum. But what's interesting is that coverage is actually more resemblant of my Myros, which is an earlier style. So you almost see the earliest forms of Corinthians are actually decently open, then they close up really tight, and then they go to the extreme and open up fully. So I think sort of, yeah, as you were sort of saying, the issue of command and control changed a lot as well. You have more individualistic, archaic, sort of warlord style fighting, and then you change that into that more strict and regulated phalanx. So you need to hear more, and you're also more covered by literally people around you as well.
I actually have a theory on this because this is the later Corinthian helmet. This is sort of its ultimate form. And you notice how long these cheek pieces are, and everything's sort of closed in. I think this form literally was designed to be worn in two positions. Be worn down on the head like a normal Corinthian helmet, and to be worn up like this. Because I can wear the earlier style Corinthians on my head. It's nowhere near as comfortable and as steady as this is. This long front, almost like the brim of a baseball cap. This whole thing holds onto your head pretty well. And I've seen guys run all over battlefields with it on their head like this. So
Yeah.
I wonder, it's almost like a built-in visor, like it goes like this or like this, and the shape of it is what allows that.
Yeah, I found that as well because I switched from the sort of Hermione to the Myros. Is I can when I'm standing still, I can tip it up fine, but I wouldn't want to run around with it like that
Yeah.
because there's just less
Yeah.
support with the actual helmet.
Yeah,
So I
and
hope,
this one too. I can barely put this. I can do that, but it's not the same. Yeah, it
yeah,
doesn't
it's
hold on.
just a little bit less, I guess, contact to the actual head itself.
Yeah.
So hopefully that answers that question there. So we have this is an interesting one. So how did they train hoplites in personal skills, collective maneuvers? Presumably they began as boys with wrestling and play fighting. And how long was a typical campaign for a citizen soldier? So I guess I'll sort of start this one off. Hoplites were sort of famously untrained, and that doesn't mean that they had no training. And this is sort of a constant debate that is going on in the current world of how much training did hoplites have, and of course that varied from time period and city-state. But famously, these guys were quite proudly untrained soldiers, citizen militia forces. So basically, any male citizen from roughly the age of 18 to 60, depending on your polis, was eligible for military service. And these campaigns typically didn't last very long. We're told sort of 3 days rations of 1 day to march, 1 day to fight, 1 day to come back, because these are your working class. These are your people who are managing farms, estates, bakeries, blacksmiths. They can't really be on campaign for very long. You do have some exceptions, which I think we have some more questions actually dedicated to the Spartans later, who seem to have practiced some amount of manoeuvring. But we don't have any explicit mentions of weapons training. We do know that there was synchronized dance, and dance and war often has sort of links made together. It is a very similar, though very different at the same time, activity. So we sort of see the implementation of training through daily activities, not specific warfare training. I think it's highly likely that in times of war you would have somewhat steady manoeuvring and staying together, just as we found in our own group. If you just have a group of guys who get together 4 times a year to do phalanx stuff, you have some problems. So I think it's decently safe to say that these guys were, not completely unregulated, but they weren't like every day or every week coming together to practice this type of stuff.
Yeah, I think the primary means of group training was through group dancing, right? So if you're doing big group dances, the kind Greeks still do today, you're learning how to move with people around you. The actual drill, so people say, well, why did I have to practice the drill? But the drill is so easy and so simple. You've seen me do this with I get a group of children together at events, and I'll give them foam shields and spears, and in 2 minutes they're doing perfect Spartan drill that Xenophon relates to us. Actually, I do it better than adults because the drill is a simple follow the leader drill. And whenever you get adults, especially if you get adults who've been in the military, and they're the worst, they try to do more, right? With kids, just follow the leader because they do exactly what you told them. And when they do that, everything works great. So dance is a big thing. We know that other things that were just like the everyday events that rich people did, like hunting, was considered a prime training for war, not just because you were out there in the fields, a bit deprived because you obviously you had to bring food with you. You're marching up hills and things. This is important. Also, you got to kill a large animal, and that if you're a city dweller who's a potter, how many times have you stabbed anything man-sized and had blood shoot out all over you, right? This is not an easy thing to do. And they did studies back in World War I where they were shooting targets, and then they went in the field and they weren't shooting humans because humans, are daunting compared to targets, right? So that's why they train everybody on human-shaped targets now. And the same thing probably held true. I mean, it's difficult to. I mean, for a hoplite in that shield wall fighting, because we've done it in mock combat, your prime target is the enemy's face. So the idea that you're going to jam a spear into the face of a guy opposite you is a really daunting question if you've not lived a life of killing things and somewhat brutality.
Yeah, definitely, and I think that really drives home with that. As young as 18, these are people that are even still in high school in today's world, and I think it's not really a surprise that lots of our casualty rates are typically quite low. I think it's more of a not necessarily a who kills the most, it's who breaks first, right? Once you break, you're done. Yeah. And I think that
they're really fighting fear more than death. right?
Yes.
You're fighting to the fear.
Yeah. Which line can literally stand there the longest is essentially a massive, not the only part, but a massive part of this style of warfare.
Yeah. And the other thing is that, Xenophon tells us that when it comes to things like sword use, he tells us that, ever since he was a boy, he would pick up any stick and smack things with it. Right. So every boy who's ever picked up a stick and beaten things and pretended he had a sword has been training with the sword his whole life. Because according to Xenophon, you don't need any more training with a sword than you would need, say, an animal would need with its horns or its claws. It would just come naturally to you, which kind of tells me that he didn't have big value on things like the weapons training of Hoplomachoi and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we do see a recurrent theme. It's a weird thing because we know there were weapons trainers, and yet they often make fun of weapons trainers. So, it's hard to say what the value was. Yeah.
So, Paul, I think this next question is something that will be interested to you because it's all about swords.
Great.
What do we know about the role of swords in hoplite warfare? It seems common to consider a sword a part of the panoply, and it makes sense as a sidearm. But all the information about Phalanx warfare I've seen concerns the use of spear and shield, and a debate as to whether the concept of orthismos has any basis at all. And overall, I cannot recall ever seeing solid information about how swords were used.
So this is a good question because the answer differs depending on when you're talking about. Every time anybody brings up hoplites with me, I always ask them when is the most important thing. Because we call this thing a hoplite. We already showed you what happens with the helmets over time, right? Everything changes over time. So in early hoplite warfare, you had guys who had spears that were 6 or 7 feet long, and they were still throwing them. And if you're going to throw a spear, it's got to be balanced in the middle. That means that your reach for that spear, of a 6-foot spear, is only 3 feet. So I can fight with you with a spear, and the guy next to me can fight with this sword and still reach his enemy and still stay in line. Right? Later on, spears grow. They become crazy. So it's possible that by the Peloponnesian Wars, definitely by the end of it, we're starting to see these spears that may be 8-9 feet long. And you can see on vases that they're gripped all the way near the back. So they're weighted so that they can be held near the back. And that's a reach of about 5-6 feet. So I can't stand in line with you and stab a guy with my spear, and you can reach your enemy with the sword. That means that if your spear breaks, you either can stand there and sort of parry with your sword, or you can move in to your enemy, like get under his spear, which is really attractive. If you're standing there getting jabbed at, it's like a boxer. When you know you're overmatched in a boxing fight, in a boxing match, what you naturally want to do is get in close and get in a clinch. It's just a natural thing to get out of the reach of the weapon, right? If you can't run away, all you can do is move in. So if you do that, though, now you're under the reach of your enemy's spear, and you have a sword. And if you have a sword that's this big or smaller, and he has a spear, he can't hit you. So he has to drop his spear and go to his sword. And I've theorized that this is essentially where orthismos comes from. Orthismos it is a state where pushing comes to being, but it's really more of a state about crowding. And the idea is once you get so close that you're shield on shield with your enemy, and you're using swords now instead of spears, then the whole dynamic changes. And now you have situations where men can come up behind you and push you into the enemy and keep you from being pushed back, keep you close, essentially. And that, more than anything else, is what I think orthismos is. I actually think there's some evidence that Greek might have used orthismos in place of the time when sword fights happen, right? Because we hear some interesting things about, there's a battle where we hear about the Corinthians being expert at sword fighting, and that's why they beat the Carthaginians, which doesn't make any sense because when are Corinthians ever experts at sword fighting? But what that may have been is a proxy for experts at fighting really close, right? So who knows? But the swords themselves go through a big evolution, and we can talk that. By the time you get to the after the Peloponnesian War, we see on vases swords this big or shorter, maybe even only like this long, right? They become essentially long daggers, and Xenophon actually uses a term enchiridion, which translates usually as dagger. And it's possible that that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a shift where we have a battle that would have once been spearmen and swordsmen fighting together at the front lines to biphasic battle, where there's a spear battle, and then that spear battle might break down into a sword fight, And then who knows? Maybe they might pull apart from the sword fight, and then maybe they'll throw spears at each other again. Who knows? We don't know what they're doing in these cycles, because there could be cycles to battle. Definitely, there's this transition, and I can say that you cannot fight with a sword at the same distance that your brothers next to you are fighting with their spear.
Yeah, basically spot on, I think. And it's interesting, I think, just again to drive that home, is that we do see that evolution to shorter swords. We see, like, by no means are ancient Greek swords long, but we see some, for the period, some decently long swords in the archaic period. And instead of progressively getting longer and longer as, metalworking technology gets better, we actually see them progressively either stay the same size or typically get shorter to basically even kitchen knives sizes. So you can imagine how in that close press, how ruthless that type of weapon would be, getting through eye holes around shields. If you had a big sword to maneuver that around, especially with other people and just in with that tight face-to-face style of combat, people often see how short that sword is and go, well, that's not very, impressive. Well, it's not very impressive, but it is very, very effective at what it's designed to do.
Oh, that's the famous Spartan who was told, who was complaining his sword was too short, and he was told to lengthen it with one step forward.
Yeah.
So yeah, the thing about swords are interesting too. I mean, I can do a whole talk on these swords because the way they were used obviously was over the top of shields. So you were limited to strikes. This strike like this actually has a name. It's seen on so many vases in the arms of a fellow named Harmodius, who was a slayer of tyrants. That it's called the Harmodius blow. This strike. So this strike may be a reverse snap strike like that, right? Obviously something over the shoulder this way. Anything you didn't have to go under the shield was obviously a viable strike. But one thing that people don't really understand about these swords, and I have a prop I can share. This obviously could stab into the neck, right? This would be pretty vicious. But along with stabbing, this thing does something else, and it's designed for it, I think. If you look at the leaf shape, notice that the leaf shape does two things. When you smash something, this is my tomato prop, when you hit something, it creates sort of a very narrow front that hits the object rather than if you hit with this sort of flat part. So narrower the front that hits the object, the more you focus the force. That's obvious. Other thing is that these swords were made for draw cuts, right? So if I go to stab your throat and I miss you, I draw back. And the shape of these blades, the way it widens towards the tip, it just draws that blade and it keeps cutting deeper and deeper and deeper as it goes forward, right? And a push cut is the opposite. A push cut goes this way, and you can see it would do that as well. So you can have push and draw cuts. And we don't see that too much in sort of modern sword play. We don't talk about that as much, but that's probably very important with these. Because it was probably really important with earlier bronze swords, which were not necessarily up to the same strength as the later steel swords. Drawing and pushing cuts, you could still have a thick midrib and do them correctly. Whereas if you're trying to slice through something with like a chopping motion or a slash, you don't want to have a thick midrib. Right? Obviously, the point is reinforced, and you can do something called tip cutting, which is essentially just slicing with the very tip. That's the fastest part of the sword when you swing it. So that's viable as well. Just a lot of things can be done with these swords that are not obvious to people who just pick them up for the first time.
Oh, absolutely.
And yes, I will wash the acid off this sword.
Okay, so next question is basically how were hoplites assigned positions in the formation? So were hoplites just randomly thrown together into phalanxes, or were they organised and sort of specifically assigned places, for example, most armoured in the front?
So that's a great question. And we know there's a name for the guys who are in the front, right? They're called promachoi. They're the front fighters, the fighters in the front. And the thing about that's interesting is how there's two parts of the question. How did they come up with them? Like why did different people stand in different places? And then did they have distinct places? And the way I would answer that is early on, most likely they were almost like a war band. So you have your richest guys in front with the best armor, and they have to be in front because they have to show off how cool they are to, warrant the fact that they are the aristocracy. And then you have poorer guys in the back. The point where in Tyrtaeus, when you read of the front lines being armored men and the back lines being naked men, which means guys just throwing spears and rocks often, they're actually treated like one unit. So they're not treated like, oh, you unit of light guys support the heavy guys. They're treated like you in the back support the guys in the front, and they're essentially one unit, one graded unit. The the thing about that is when you do that, there's two ways to do that. One, just get in a big bunch, right? You show up on the battlefield, everybody walks up in a big aisle, and then you sort it out on the battlefield. That's kind of what it seems happens if you read like the Saxon poems. I mean, there's a great Saxon poem of the Battle of Malden where the leader is actually telling people where to stand before the battle starts. He rides and rules. He rides up and down the line, putting people where he wants them, right? So that's a possibility. But in later hoplites, and you've done this when all of the order is set in the marching column. So you know who's going to be the front man, and whoever that's going to be, maybe you elect him because he's the best fighter. You're probably related because you're from the same tribe and things like that. You put him in the front, and then you grade yourself back to the old guy like me in the back who holds up the end, who we're told should be the steadiest because he's the guy who would have to be the first to run away, right? So you grade them like that, and you set them up in lines of 8, let's say, if you want an 8-man phalanx, and then just stack front to back, front to back, front to back along your whole marching column. And then when you get there, you just peel off each front man to the left and you form up a perfect phalanx. It's really easy. This is the thing. This is, like I said, we have kids do it. It's a really simple thing. And forming, sort of coming from a line to a formation, then from a formation to the line, both are really simple. You can do it very quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and we often see that the difficulty comes from when you try to do more than that, right? That's when people start to have a lot of trouble, and that's when that sort of extra disciplinary actions that are perhaps taught in Sparta and later Thebes really come into play.
Well, this is interesting because, as I said, military guys are always a problem because they know more modern drill that relies on you knowing your place in these formations more than the ancient drill. Well, the ancients didn't know that because it didn't exist, right? So they just followed these simple rules, and everything turned out okay as long as it was simple. So I'll give you another example. When we're marching in a big phalanx, we're already set up in our files and ranks, and we're marching forward. The easiest way to do that is to make sure your men are touching each other. So as long as they're linked together, where the shield sort of comes like this, and I sort of put my arm behind the shield, have my spear up, this physical contact is enough to keep us all linked together as one creature, essentially, and we can advance. And this works really well. I mean, we've had very little trouble advancing and keeping order like this. Matter of fact, it's funny because you're more likely to sort of wheel side to side than to break up. So the group does work as a full, almost an organic unit. If you try to set the men apart from each other, like let's say put 3 feet of space between the men, really difficult to keep them in any kind of coherence when you advance. And this holds true all the way up to running. So all the way to running, you can run touching the men next to you and you'll stay in your groups. And we've done all kinds of tests with this. You can, as long as you're running and sort of touching, the moment you stop, everybody stops, right? Whereas if you try to run and you're just relying on your visual cues, that's really difficult. You're definitely going to overshoot the guys next to you.
Yeah, definitely. Question 5. So what is it actually like handling the shield in a man-to-man fight? Have you been able to throw javelins in the armour and with the shield? How quickly can you get the panoply on, and is it faster with servants? Have you done matches like your fight with the mercenary with Persian slash Median reenactors? If so, what's that like? And do you have trouble with formation movements with helmets and shields? So,
hell of a question.
It's quite a few questions in one, really, isn't it?
Let me answer the first part about the shield in duels, and then I'll throw it to you because your armor is much more extensive than mine, and you'll have better insight. So, handling a shield in a duel is actually really quite easy, and at least my understanding and what I teach on spear fighting comes from an amalgamation of the ancient writings, the ancient depictions on vases, and then the mixture of the Renaissance fight manuals and some Asian martial arts as well. And when we're doing this, you can find video of us fighting online. The shield is not held across the body in the front like this while fighting. The shield is held out. Well, not straight out, but a little bit in front of the body. And if you do that, you can essentially shade the whole front of your body from your enemy's spear, but it's out further away. And what that does is, being out further away, it actually blocks more of the body, almost the same way a buckler is held at full extension of the hand. And it allows you to intercept weapons further from the body. Right. So this gives you many advantages. So the notion that the shield is so heavy that you can't do this, it was a fallacy. First off, the shields are not that heavy. Second of all, the shield on the porpax, the grip that goes around your forearm, it's such a great design that the shield itself feels a lot lighter even than it is. So my shield's like 16 pounds, which is pretty heavy, but I have no problem using it in dueling like this. You can hold it almost at full extension and just fight that way. The other thing is that um, the shield itself can be used as a weapon. So especially when guys are coming in at me, right? So if they're going to come in at me, you'll see guys all the time do this. They'll sort of shield bash against each other, but sort of the flat. And that's almost worthless unless you can really knock somebody off balance and get an advantage. That doesn't work so well. What works better is if you're holding it out anyway, the edge of the shield, the blade of the shield. And we can't actually even do this in mock combat because it's too dangerous. But there are many times in mock combat when they'll be opened, and if they're really close, you could just push in that to the face, to the chest, to the ribs. We can't do it because there's no good way to pad that. So that's something that we don't really get to do in live fighting, but it would have happened in dueling, surely.
Yeah, I think that's a big misconception. It's actually the Aspis is often posed as a very immovable shield that just sits there, when you can be very active with these things, and the artwork shows this, right? Like you see, especially archaic depictions, you have this sort of pose where the shield is held out away, and that covers, in theory, more. Like it gives you more time to intercept, and basically covers more because it's closer to the actual weapon. As for throwing, yes, you can throw an armour, and in fact, this is a big component, likely, of archaic era warfare. So we have depictions of hoplites bringing 2 spears to battle. The Chigi Vase is a great example of that, and they have something called an ankyle on them, which is basically a little loop, a throwing loop. And I've been experimenting a lot with this recently, actually, and I will be doing a dedicated video to sort of this archaic style of throwing shortly, hopefully. And this thing works great, especially I think we have to keep in mind that these guys probably weren't doing Olympic level throwing. They weren't running up and stretching out and throwing full force. These guys are fundamentally still trying to not get hit themselves by throwing projectiles. So these ankyles basically add a sling effect. They give you a lot more momentum and add about a third, I've found, of additional range to your throw. I'm not by any means a great javelin thrower, but I think it still gives a pretty decent idea of how much extra force these things are giving you. But it also lets you throw with considerable force without exposing yourself quite a lot. And of course, the more armoured you are, the more restricted you will be in that quite awkward javelin motion. It's not like a baseball throw. It is an odd sort of position that you have to put your body in. And the more armour you have, especially if you're throwing with armour, does impede that a little bit. But with the addition of that ankyle, you can essentially whip that spear through sort of behind your shield and do that and get quite a considerable, powerful and accurate throw. So throwing with this stuff is, definitely doable, and it was done historically, almost certainly. And I think it's a very dynamic sort of interesting. I always find the archaic style of warfare more interesting, personally. I just think there's more to it in a way, and it's a little bit more mysterious, which I always think is sort of fun. But yeah, so very much
more heroic.
Yes, more heroic, and I like the armour, a little biased. But anyway, so yeah, I think you can very much throw in it. You can move, I think, a lot more dynamically than the hoplite is often given credit for. And this sort of earlier style of armour is actually very reminiscent of later medieval coverage, right? You have basically full panoply, full harness in the most armoured archaic hoplite. You have sabatons, you have greaves, you have cuisses, you have thorax, you have upper and lower arms, you have helmet, and you have a massive shield. So you are incredibly, incredibly well protected, and it's in an era where you are the least covered by bodies around you. So definitely you could still move quite effectively in full panoply.
And that's something that often gets mistaken too, is that the phalanx itself is not really restrictive in terms of you moving out of the phalanx. So when we were doing tests throwing spears, we would just have the guy step forward a step or two out of phalanx, throw, and fall back into the shield wall. And that's doable. So there's this perception that the wall itself is somehow glued together and you can't move independently, but you definitely can. I mean, it's very easy. You can imagine if the shield walls were facing each other and you were just out of range, a man could just step forward out of that and strike. Now, he'd open himself up, possible. So when we talk about even, people doing mistaken heroics on the battlefield and, things like that, it can happen even in a shield wall formation. You can have somebody who does an individual action in a shield wall.
Well, I mean, we even know at Plataea, what is it? Aristodemus, the Spartan that ran and basically tried to kill as many Persians as he could to redeem himself. And then the Spartan's like, well, we don't want to redeem someone who basically did something heroic for the sake of being heroic, right? So
right. Well, that's the thing. So you mean even moving out of formation like that on a very short scale could be what we're seeing when we're thinking about these heroic actions that are being done.
Okay, so next question is, what's the deal with the Man of Honor spot, and how did that start? So I'm assuming he's talking about the sort of front rankers, specifically the sort of front right of the phalanx is often the honoured spot. And that's
what I think he's talking about. I think he's talking about the right flanker, yeah.
Yeah, so that sort of stems, I think, predominantly that's where the control comes from of the phalanx. Is basically that's the head of the snake. So whatever the right side does, the line, the sound wave, if you will, of the formation will sort of follow that. So often you would have kings and generals and other high up leaders positioned on that front rank, very much in the front of that formation. And I think that's something that later Roman military leaders, you had centurions that were on the fronts, but otherwise typically your actual battlefield overseers were away from the battle. Whereas in these sort of Hellenic style warfares, you have your leaders, your kings are on that very forefront of that formation. So that's sort of where that comes from. We know that certain polis, I believe Sparta puts sometimes Olympic champions in that sort of front as well. Whereas other polis sometimes put inexperienced people in the front and experienced people in the back. So it is sort of a little bit of a mix and match between different battles and different polis themselves, I think is decently safe to say.
Well, there's an answer that's probably not going to satisfy the listeners, but one of the reasons why that right front station is so important has nothing to do with the actual phalanx. It has to do with when you're marching to the battlefield in that line. The guy who ends up on the right front is the guy who leads the line into battle, right? So your leader is going to be the guy who's going to end up on the right front just because of the way they deploy. Remember I said they march up and everyone veers off to the left, right? So that right front guy is going to be your leader. Now, the other thing is, as you alluded to, when you're moving, that guy on the right has a huge responsibility because the whole line wants to push with the right. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One reason is that when you're marching, your body is twisted to keep your shield forward, so you're actually angled a little this way, so it's very difficult not to veer that way. The Thucydides tells us that they're doing it to sort of stay covered under the shields of the men next to them. Basically, it could all be true, right? So there is that as well. That guy on the right has to do like a 2-point sighting in the distance to keep that line straight. And if he doesn't do that, the whole line will veer to the right.
Which we are also told sometimes is lines will essentially do this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, they definitely did. To the point where it's funny because the right front is the station of honor, but it's also the most likely place not to have an enemy in front of you when the battle starts because you will have overlapped.
Well, and that's also something that's interesting to note, and that's something that's very different at Leuctra, is that typically you have, elite army versus least elite. You have, right flank versus left flank, and then right flank versus left flank. So you often have this idea of these battles essentially spinning, of the elite of this side pushes the amateur of that side, and basically armies do that. So it's just sort of the makeup of the way that these armies were structured, and again, sort of in a way that you don't need lots of regulation as well.
And it's weird because it's such an obvious thing that's happening, right? So everyone knows for hundreds of years that the best army is going to be on the right, and it's going to face the worst army not the worst, but the second best, at least, on the left of the foe. And yet, really, I think it's Brasidas first does this at Amphipolis, and then we see famously the Thebans do it. They put their best units up against the best Spartan units, so head to head with the best versus the best. So it's just interesting that you had this weird situation for a long time where there was like unspoken that this was okay.
Yeah, this was just the way that you do it. Yeah. Okay, this next question, I think, is probably a decently decisive answer. So, what happened during a battle if the hoplites break formation? I think it's decently safe to say that you lose the battle. is sort of the very quick answer of that. I think as soon as you find yourself separated, you're in a lot of trouble yourself. But if your entire line breaks, you would likely concede defeat, I think is probably a decently safe answer.
So here's another answer that's not obvious. A lot of people don't know this about hoplite warfare. The battle lines almost always broke, but the way they broke is that one side broke and ran, one side broke and chased. And that's why when we talk about equipment for battle, like, oh, is this sword a great sword for fighting in a phalanx? It maybe or may not be. But we have to ask ourselves, is it a good sword for chasing down a guy running away from me and killing him and stealing his armor? Because that's also part of battle and an important one. So we have these occurrences where the men who are running away will sometimes make stands. Small groups will stand together and fight. And this was famously, Socrates famously stood over Alcibiades' body and things like this. So these men who stand actually survive better because no one wants to fight them. They just run around them and chase the other guys. So that gives you an idea, though, that the chasing army is also broken its formation. Otherwise, this guy would just get run over, right? So the chasing that's involved, and really, this is when you see horsemen and light troops come into their own, because we're told that a hoplite army can beat another hoplite army, but they can't really achieve victory without light troops or cavalry, because they're the ones that really run down the other hoplites and kill them or capture them. Right? Usually, a hoplite army can run away from another hoplite army because they throw away their shield and all their stuff, and the attacking army doesn't want to do that, so they can get away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely, I think if you're the first side to break, you're probably in trouble. Yeah, but yeah, you're right. We do hear, because I believe it's at Delium, isn't it, that Socrates stands over?
Yeah, I think it might have been. Yeah,
I think so.
The other thing, and this is interesting, go back to one of our earlier questions, is that we're told that the weapons training of hoplomakoi, so weapons trainers, is really most important when everything breaks down. So you can imagine that as a phalanx, fighting in a phalanx, you don't need that much sort of martial arts training with weapons. But once you find yourself fighting one-on-one, one-on-two, then that's when masters come into their own.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Did bronze cuirasses really fall out of fashion during and after the Peloponnesian War in favour of lighter to no armour? I think this is decently safe to say not really. So we very much see bronze armours in the archaic period. Of course, we have the bell cuirass, the transistor cuirass, the muscle cuirass, but this is still used into the Hellenistic and even the Roman period and after that. And the whole idea that sort of the lighter, which through my experience isn't necessarily the case, tube and yoke style armours overthrew the bronze style armours isn't correct. They coexisted for hundreds of years, and it's interesting because, and I've talked about this a lot in lots of my sort of cuirass videos, is often the idea is bronze armour is heavier and less mobile, linen and leather armour is lighter and more mobile. But this really isn't the case. It depends highly on the biggest things, the fit of your armour, right? If you have a well-fitting bronze thorax, you're going to move very, very well in that. But also it depends on the construction of the tube and yoke that we're talking about. The heaviest armours that I've held are actually tube and yokes. Scaled, typically leather scaled tube and yokes are the heaviest armours that I've held. Equally, the lightest armours I've held are also just plain linen tube and yokes. So we have a large spectrum of, how were these made and what were they reinforced with plays a massive part in how heavy these armours are. But bronze thorax and tube and yokes were relatively used through the same time periods, really. We see a stylistic change from the bell armour to the muscle cuirass, but still bronze thorax being used into the Hellenistic period. So it's not really an organic armor overrides the bronze. It's just perhaps you're filling the ranks with people who can't afford as much armor, so they might be assuming that the tube and yoke is a cheaper alternative. You have more lower echelon citizens fighting in the force, and I think that's probably a massive part why we see progressively little armor in the sort of classical period from the archaic, is you are having to fill ranks with basically forcefully conscripted people. You might have, for instance, Sparta forcefully conscripting helots to fight. Well, helots aren't going to be affording full panoply, so they might get issued a shield and helmet, and that's it. So that's probably a big reason as to why we sort of see an evolution away from armor, is just you're filling it with more people, and more people who aren't necessarily as high up on that list.
Yeah, no, it's true. My theory is that that's where the lambda comes from, right? That that the lambda was first given to helots when they were distributing them armor and jumping them up into hoplites. So, if you got that lambda tattoo, may not be a Spartan.
Yep. Oh, unless Brasidas frees you, and then at least you won't be a slave anymore.
That's right.
Okay, so next question. What was the legal pretext required for hoplite service? Was the legal obligation of Athenian or Plataean or etc. to serve in a phalanx, or what was their sort of purpose for serving in a phalanx if it wasn't for home defence? And I think that's sort of a decently simple answer is just to uphold your citizenship, you sort of had to serve as a hoplite. So when you were called upon for duty, you sort of had to accept that. And we have to remember that most of these bats were relatively small. We have like large-scale wars, but otherwise most of it is simply put sort of, border exchanges, farmland, fertile fields, Greece, which can be, a bit few and far between. If you're in a very rocky place, this one big flat field, you might have annually a same battle at the same place. So even most of these battles were for the benefit of your polis anyways, right? Even if you were the aggressors or the defenders. So we don't really have... Oh, sorry, yeah, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's what my question back would have been. So how do you define the benefit of the home defense, right? So the Athenians would have called all of their overseas sea battles home defense.
Yeah, so I think that one's decently answered there. Okay, this is a bit of a longer question. So in some older German history books, I read that a few times hoplites used iron armour, and as vague as it is there, they seem to be talking about iron plates and helmets, not chainmail. Was iron armour used in a hoplite context in the classical period?
It's a really big question because, so here's the thing. We see lots and lots of these tube and yoke armors, it's what some people call linothorax, these tube and yoke armors covered in scales. And we're safe if we assume that they're bronze scales, because we know they were bronze scales. We have a couple examples, but really not that. We don't have a lot of surviving scales, right? So if we don't have a lot of surviving scales, we don't have the evidence basis to say that they were all bronze. I have a sneaky suspicion that maybe a large percentage of these were iron, and that's how they was the iron. That was the way that hoplites used iron in armor, not as plates, but as scales. Now, we see Sparta, they were so rich in iron that they were using large iron spits as money, right? So why would you not make scales? I can understand why you wouldn't make plates. It's difficult to make uniform iron plates, but iron scales is not that difficult, especially if you're using, I can chop this sword blade into scales, right? So I think I would rate that as a probability that there were iron scales. On the flip side, we do see full iron plate, but that happens later. So famously, there's an iron armor that is designed to look like a tube and yoke armor that was buried with Philip, right? So this is a fully blown, iron plated armor. There's a couple others, but they're pretty late. We don't see a lot of iron armor. Even things that look like they're iron could be bronze. So it's hard to say whether something silvery or described as silvery was even iron. Yeah, that's really what it comes down to. It's hard to say. Now, do we see any any iron elsewhere? Well, we see, like, for instance, iron sauritors. So sauritors, that the bronze tips of the spears, we usually consider them bronze, but there are many of them made of iron. So they definitely were using iron in a lot of ways. The real problem, I think, is we just don't have the surviving examples to tell us what they were doing.
Well, and that's one of our biggest issues, right? And that's some way where we're blessed with the hoplite world. There's lots of our stuff's bronze, so it survives really well.
Yeah.
And the iron stuff you might think doesn't exist, but maybe it did. It just rusted away.
Well, there's an example, a great example. Is that there is a helmet, but it's an Assyrian helmet. And the Assyrian helmet is cut in half, and it's half bronze, half iron. And we only know about it because the bronze part is there with a little fringe of iron on the inside.
Oh, really? I've not seen that.
Gone. Yeah, it's an excellent helmet. I think it's in the British Museum. But yeah, so we wouldn't have known it if it was all iron. It would have fallen apart. It was only because it was part bronze that actually survived.
Super interesting. Okay, next question. This one is maybe a little bit weird to answer is, when was the last documented battle that hoplites were mentioned? And I think this sort of comes down to, what do we mean when we mean hoplites? Because from a period term, it basically just means man who's equipped. So the same way that we might say soldier, you could say American soldier or Russian soldier. So even to the ancient Greeks, the Persians could very much be hoplites. They're men equipped. So it basically stems to, I'm guessing we typically mean, when we're talking about hoplites, ancient Greek heavy infantry.
Usually, we date the end of the hoplite to about the time that the Spartans switched over to Ceresophora under Cleomenes. So there's a reform in about 230, around that date, where the Spartan king is reforming the remnants of the old Spartan army, and he finally takes them and he reforms them onto the model of the Macedonian army and gives them pikes. And pretty much everywhere else in Greece had already done this. So he does that at that point. And that's kind of like the end of the hoplite at that point. Normally we think of the troops after that, even the ones that look kind of hoplitey, right? So we have things like Thureophori that are using a different shield than the Aspis, but there's, ranks of spearmen. Yeah, so I would say that's probably about it. The only possibility is there's possible that the Achaean army sort of recreated hoplites again. We're unsure whether they created hoplites or something else. That's a possibility. And if that were the case, then it still would have been another maybe 50 years and they were gone. Yeah. So I would say sometime between 220 and, I don't know, 180, something like that. Yeah.
Or to be real pedantic, even modern military are still hoplites.
That's right. That's right. Well, that's the other thing, and this is a topic for another video. But to the Greeks, a hoplite was anybody who fulfilled the role of a spearman in a rank, right? So those were hoplites. Anybody fully equipped for battle, who looked like he could be fully equipped for battle, would be a hoplite.
Right. And this leads on very nicely to our next question, which I guess we sort of answered, is how much would you extend the term hoplite? Do you limit it only to the Greeks? For example, the Carthaginian citizen soldiers seem to have fought very much like hoplites, or at least similarly equipped. Is it cultural or purely technical? So I guess we sort of answered that. It sort of depends what we mean when we mean hoplite. I think typically
that's the thing.
In the modern world, we're typically referring to ancient Greek heavy infantry, although people could say Carthaginian hoplites, I suppose, as well. I've heard that term.
I think it's like, the thing about the term hoplite is like, it's like the term panzer, right? So if I say panzer, you immediately think I'm talking about a German tank, probably from World War II,
yeah.
Right? So that term has weight, but it just means armor, right? So to them, it doesn't mean anything specific, but to us, it means something specific. So for instance, the hoplite itself probably originated in Anatolia. We're told that elements of the hoplite panoply, the shield, the crested helmet, they come from the Carians, and probably, they even go into the Neo Hittites and that whole group as well. They probably would have been very hoplitey. So the origin of the hoplites and sort of what we consider a hoplite is not the same. Now, generally, our term hoplite covers anything that was sort of touched by the Greek world and took on their tactics. So Etruscans are considered to be hoplites, right? So the Magna Graecians, the Greeks in Italy, the hoplites from the Etruscan hoplites, really even the Phoenician hoplites, we would consider them hoplites because they were sort of influenced and took on the panoply of the Greeks.
Right. Okay, next question. And we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but this is an interesting one. So how big or small of a role did missile troops, such as slingers and archers, play in Greek armies, and how common were javelineers in general? So do you want to start with
this is a question of dating. Yeah. So it's a question of dating, right? So in the archaic period, they were a crucial role because they were part of every formation. So you always had light troops with you. Later on, they become separate units, and they can be really important. So there's a couple battles. There's obviously the famous Sphacteria, these battles where the light troops defeated hoplites, but there are quite a few of them. So there are a number of times when, for instance, the Athenians are marching through a defile in sort of western Greece, and they're slaughtered by light troops throwing rocks and things down from the hills. then, of course, they do the same thing to the Spartans with their light troops. And you can have situations where light troops harassing the heavy troops can cause them to stop their moving, can sort of control the mobility on the battlefield, things like that. And that's really their role in the classical period. They have two roles. They have the role of, limiting battlefield mobility, which means, like, let's say my army has overlapped yours. We talked about at the beginning of this discussion. I want to come around and attack your flank. I can't do it if there's light troops on my flank because I have no way of stopping them, right? So that's really the prime role of light troops. And then even back in the archaic, the second role, like I said, is to chase down the defeated enemy. And it's kind of funny because one of the things that the hoplites themselves, like Xenophon, read about, is that the light troops will often get there first and steal all the good stuff, right? So,
And now they're a hoplite for the next battle.
yeah. So yeah, it is an issue, and the same thing. He didn't ask about cavalry, but the cavalry is the same way. So it has a very specific purpose. A group of horsemen, a small group of horsemen, 50 horsemen can hold up 1,000 hoplites if they're used properly, right? So they can do these things. Now, what they can't do is stand toe to toe with hoplites. None of them can. So this is why hoplites were still the sort of the kings of the battlefield, is because if you were either horsemen or peltasts and you get yourself caught by hoplites, you were done. So if there's a situation where, like, for instance, Xenophon tells us at one point, when he's facing light troops walking up a mountain, to walk not in a line, but in groups like this. And the idea is if they go between, you'll catch them, right? And they give way and run away. Famously, the Spartans used to send their youngest troops out who were fast enough to catch them. And for a while that worked, and eventually that stopped working. But for a while, they were the terror of light troops, and the light troops wouldn't even face them for a while.
Thanks very much for watching part 1 of the 2-part series where we answer your questions about ancient Greek warfare. Make sure to stay tuned for part 2 coming out shortly. Thanks very much for watching this video, and thanks very much to our channel members who continually support the channel. It truly does mean a lot, and if you yourself would like to support the channel further, channel memberships are a great help. If not, no worries at all. Just liking the video, subscribing, and sharing this type of niche content around people who might find it interesting is a great help. Thanks very much, and hopefully catch you in the next one.